friends, and welcome back to Tim Kirby Russia, where I, veteran political analyst and radio talk show host Tim Kirby, smugly tell you about how the world looks through a Russian lens. Our guest today is under a code name because Mr. Afanasy is also a foreign person who fled to Russia. However, he lives in secret, and he's going to talk to us about a particular conspiracy theory from the Russian internet that he believes to be very true. I'm not quite sold on it, but I think it's actually very relevant because it could explain the entire logic of the war in Ukraine. So anyways, we'll get to this mysterious Khazarian conspiracy that Afanasy is an expert on a little bit later. But for now, let's talk briefly about what conspiracy theories on the Russian internet tend to look like. So like wacko conspiracy theories in Russia that are sort of the easily disproven flat earth kind generally have one of three elements. They either include paganism, prehistory, or the Russian alphabet. Now, that sounds strange, but we'll get to that. Now, one thing about prehistory is that Russian written history, where we actually know what's going on, really only starts with like the arrival of Christianity, and even from that time period, virtually nothing is left. So we're talking sort of the middle of the medieval period, late medieval period, is when you first start getting like, documentation or scraps of information that are left over in Russian archives. Now, obviously, back then, people weren't writing blogs. They weren't talking about like their daily lives. What we find is religious material or something, laws, like there's this thing called Ruskaya Pravda, which, although Pravda means truth now, it was sort of like the first written set of laws. It mostly had to deal with laws related to inheritance. But anyways, so for example, what do we learn about ancient Russians in the medieval period from their inheritance laws? Well, maybe something, but not that much. And so because Russian prehistory is not that far away and is basically, uncategorized, unwritten, you can make up anything you want. There's this one conspiracy I've seen a bunch of times online about ancient Russians marched and conquered China 7,000 years ago. It's the truth that they don't want to reveal. That's probably like my favorite one. A lot of them have to do with sort of like a militarism thing where there was some sort of conquest of some people at some time that no one knows about and it's secret. Russians conquered Atlantis or something. It's kind of like how every former Soviet republic except for Russia, says that Jesus was born there. We've seen books where people have written that like Jesus from Kazakhstan and Georgia and Armenia. Well, Armenia is at least kind of close, but Kazakhstan's a bit far away. Ukraine, of course, has sort of similar material, so on and so forth. So anyways, big thing is of Russian conspiracy theories are the secret prehistory that they don't want you to know about. But guess what, guys? Russians don't know. It's prehistory. They really don't know. It's a complete blank slate, and that's why it can be filled with all sorts of magical garbage. Number two would be paganism. This sort of ties into prehistory because with paganism, especially for Russians, now I think some of like the Scandinavian like sagas were written down and recorded after Christianity. So they were at least recorded, maybe, with a couple passing generations of Christians recording it. They probably put a negative slant on things, who knows. There's a lot of, runic writings that were left on wood and stuff, so at least there's something. But for Russians, there's nothing. The pagan period, there's like totem poles and stuff that people found, or stories about how when the Orthodox spread, I think, towards like the city of Perm, they would have these sort of like big tree trunks, sort of like totem pole idols that they worshipped. When they converted to Christianity, they would throw like blood and guts on them. And the story goes that when they converted to Christianity, they just sort of carved a Jesus-like image into the idols and threw blood and guts on Jesus too. So it took a while for Christianity to take hold around Perm. But so anyways, with paganism being completely vague, it can be exploited. And there are plenty of these stupid pagan groups online that they say that somehow some idiot in a one-room apartment who's probably a virgin knows about all these deep, dark, ancient secrets that he's going to reveal, and he knows. No one knows, because paganism, especially for Russia, like the names of the pagan gods, like Perun and Svarozhets or whatever, they exist, but overall, everything was lost from that period. So it gives a lot of leeway for people to make crap up. Now, about alphabet conspiracy theories. Now, the Russian alphabet currently has 33 letters, which works really well. It's probably never going to get any smaller. Alphabets tend to historically shrink as, dead weight is lost or whatever. But it used to have 49. And 49 makes this nice sort of like 7x7 grid. And oh man, there are so many of these people online who are giving these seminars about like the secret meanings of the word, the letters. And each letter used to have like a word associated with it. Apparently English did too. Like there used to be a letter thorn, which kind of looked like a P, but kind of a Y, and it was thorn because it made the th sound. So Russian has this. Like you may hear the old term for alphabet was like azbuka, because like the first word was like Azi, Buki, and then so on. But anyways, so they all have like a special name, and these have some kind of deeper secret meanings. And guys, this actually kind of stuff went really mainstream, especially thanks to a certain comedian who I had the chance to meet before he died. So there's this comedian, Mikhail Zadornov, and he really got deep into this. Now the question is, did he really believe this, or was this some kind of like weird Andy Kaufman, like breaking the fourth wall kind of comedy? We'll never know because he's passed and he didn't leave any information about it. But it seems as though he's pretty serious. And I mean, he would say stuff like, for example, the Russian word for, I don't know, like being, I would translate it as glad, like, I'm glad that this happened, is rad, R-A-D, okay, rad. And it's the word that makes like the term rainbow. Raduga is like a gladness arc, okay, like arc, all right, makes sense, I guess. And he would go to the extent of like making videos online saying like, well, Raduga, but that's in the heavens, and it's amazing. And why Rad? Because of the Egyptian god Ra. I am not kidding you. So, like, he had all these, like, video lecture seminars about connecting Russian words to every possible something somewhere that ever happened to make Russia seem like the origin of all human civilization, and that's just not the case. Rad and Raduga and any other word like Radonish, or is it Radonish? I always say it wrong. So Radonish, the city in Russia, are not connected with the ancient Egyptian gods. Okay, guys? But dude, if you want to, guys, believe me, if there's any BS conspiracy theory that you're going to see on the Russian internet, it is going to have the ancient Russian alphabet with its 49 letters. We're going to see tons of paganism stuff, talking about prehistory that nobody knows.
Здравствуйте, друзья! Меня зовут Андрей Ивашко.
Здравия, добрые молодцы, красной девицы, а здесь Иван-Царевич на сером волке.
Сейчас мы с вами поговорим об образе буквицы «аз». «Аз» – самая первая буквица в нашей азбуке, в древнеславянской буквице, обозначает связь с истоком.
And the main thing is, guys, the Russian alphabet, it came from Christianity. And it's always these weird pagan people that talk about it. It just drives me nuts because it's always these weird pagans that want to like convince you that there's a secret ancient Russian religion that's been hidden by Christianity. But the letters came from the Christians. They originate in like Greek and then sort of modifying some Hebrew characters. Oh, it's just infuriating. But you know what's really infuriating? The war in Ukraine. And possibly its origin lies in a conspiracy of 1,000 years. And right now, we're going to talk to a man codenamed Afanasi about that. Okay, Afanasi. So, as I may have mentioned in this video before, I don't remember how I edited things, that there are sort of two kinds of conspiracies. There's the ancient aliens kind and the biolab network kind that gets proven to be true. So anyways, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt here. Could you tell us how, like, this ancient empire of Khazaria has led to the desire to create some sort of like super new greater Israel in Ukraine? What's going on with this here? And well, first off, who are these Khazar people anyways?
To go just directly into your question, I think to some people, biolab networks sounded just as crazy as ancient alien theories, right? So, it's really what you're willing to consider or entertain comes out of your knowledge base, right? And how educated you are in any particular area, right? So to those with rudimentary familiarity of Khazarian history, as well as this particular tribe's modus operandi, the Zionists, that is, the theory of Khazarian roots of the present crisis doesn't really sound that implausible. But again, it depends on what knowledge set you're deriving your worldview, as well as your geopolitical assumptions from, right? So I think we have to understand that there's not only a geopolitical motivation here, because I think that's where a lot of people get hung up, but there's also an eschatological motivation, right? And for those of you listening who may not be familiar with that particular term, it's the understanding of the way all things culminate, right? It's a religious view, it's a metaphysical view. It's the understanding of this particular people group and their own destiny in human history, right? So the geopolitical manifestations are rooted in eschatological ideology, right? So it's an in-group manifestation that comes from this particular tribal affiliation and their worldview. So this is a very, very important distinction to make when we're looking at this, right? So to steelman your position from the question, I think you're saying basically it sounds crazy that a group of people would hold something against another group of people for like 1,000 years, right? So that's really not what I'm saying at all. I do think there are some people on the internet that may make that claim. I have come across them, as have you. But I think what I'm really saying is that the ancient empire of Khazaria is the single greatest achievement and test case for the realization of this particular in-group's eschatology up to that point in history. So what does that mean practically? It means that Jewish eschatology, rabbinic eschatology, holds that a day will come when the rabbis and their tribe, the Zionists, will rule over all non-Jews. So this is the goyim, as they talk about it within their own text, the goy or the goyim. And these are the non-Jews. So in Khazaria, this was exactly the case, according to all historians, both Arab sources, Byzantine sources, and Russian sources on this matter. The Jews ruled over non-Jews. They had a geographical land empire that existed specifically with this model in place, right? So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in this particular region of ancient Khazaria, that Jews who were in the first place where the Almighty delivered the goyim into their hands to be ruled over, that this would have anything less than monumental significance. Not only the history of this and what it means for them, but also for the land itself, right? If we know anything about Zionists, they are extremely tied to land that they view having redemptive historical significance. What do I mean by redemptive historical significance? I mean, it's where their view is that the Almighty delivered them out of the hands of, let's say, the Persians in this case, and then delivered them into Khazaria, because that's where the original Khazars come from. They come from Persia, and prior to that, from the diaspora out of Jerusalem. So they got assumed into the Sassanid dynasty, Sassanid Empire, I should say, and they through their several hundred years over there, amassed power within there, and had this very interesting revolution around the turn of the 5th into the 6th century under a guy named Mazdak. So he's a very high up nobleman in the priest, really, is what we would probably consider him. Within the Persian class there, he was so not a Jew, but he was of the Persians, so the Iranian ruling class. But there's this revolution that happens under him, and he has all these Jewish followers. So there's two types of Jews within the empire. I should do a little quick prolegomena here on this. So there's those Jews who were with Mazdak, this priest and sort of political figure, and there were those who were against him. Those who were against him were only against him because they were with the king at the time, whose name, believe it or not, is Kovid. It's more like Kovad, but either way, you'll frequently hear it just pronounced Kovid. So they're with this particular king as a ruling class. These are the very wealthy Jews of Persia at the time. And those particular ones opposed Mazdak because Mazdak was basically a crypto communist. You can go back and read all of the historians' accounts of his doctrines. He was talking about equality and brotherhood, and how the wealthy were alienating the people from their lands. I mean, this literally just sounds like something out of Marx and and Engels and so forth, right? This kind of underpinning of the philosophy that Mazdak's beliefs were predicated on. So he uses the other group of Persian Jews, which were not with the wealthy, right? And they together they have this uprising that occurs. And at that time, the crypto communists win for a short period. And during that time, you have this large group of Persian Jews, as well as some of the communist Iranians, that basically get control of the treasury. And they sack most of the loot out of the Persian ruling class at the time, and they flee with it. And those particular original Persian Jews who fled with it, they fled through trade routes that went up the north of the Persian Empire into the Caucasus. They would have been familiar with these as traders, which many of the Persian Jews were traders. Again, you can read about this in the source texts as well. Slave traders in particular, actually. But they dealt with all the Silk Road trade. So spices, fabrics, gold, myrrh, dyes, etc. All the typical types of things that you see coming through the Silk Road out of China. So they flee up into this area where this group of people known as the Khazars lived, and they settled in with them. And having all of this wealth, they were able to take over various trades within the Khazarian cognate, and they were able to continue to amass quite a bit of power underneath this until eventually, what arises is a literally a Jewish state underneath the Khazar Khanate. So that's sort of a little backstory, just to kind of give some info dump on what we're dealing with there, as far as Khazaria goes.
Now, many years ago on the radio, we had a guest, and he actually talked about Khazaria, and he was a historian, so a real bona fide historian, and he said that really people over-dramatize this whole Khazaria thing, that really only some of the leadership dabbled in Judaism, as he called it, that it was sort of this generic amalgamation of sort of nomadic peoples, and it wasn't really such a big thing. It wasn't really like this Israel outside of Israel, okay? So if you think about it, like, why would Israeli Zionists have some sort of deep passion for this weird kind of sort of race mixing, unofficial minority Jewish leadership group? Why would they be so excited about that?
Sure. That's a great question. It's a great question. So I think there's several parts to that question, and I will tackle the historiography corrections that I think are presupposed in your question that need to be corrected first, because I think what you heard on that program is a common misconception, and I will just kind of give you my knowledge base from the source texts themselves. Which at the end of this, I will give you a list of source texts for all the viewership to go and check out themselves. In other words, don't take my word for it. There's tons of great source texts on this stuff that I will give you guys access to just kind of be able to go and do a little bit of research yourself, just as I have done. So I think we'll start with the historiography questions that are presupposed in there. And I think there's a couple things that need to be corrected. So the number one would be, it's important to remember that again, these guys came out of the Sassanid period. Okay, so they're the particular Jewish group. When looking at the Khazarian Empire, there's one thing all of the source texts agree on in terms of their culture. Their culture was thoroughly Iranian, what they call Aryo-Iranian or Persian, right? So all of the artwork, for example, in what's left of either, you can find coins, for example, that are dug up, or shields, or various excavations have been done, for example, on the fortress at Sarkel, as well as in the modern region at the Volga River Delta, where Ital used to be, right? Ital is this is their major city. This is the city of the capital city of their empire, right? Which, interestingly enough, was split into two parts, Tim. So there was basically a kosher side, and there was a multinational, multicultural side. So the kosher side, we'll call it, was the Jewish side, and it was walled up. Only Jews and Jewish converts could live within this part of the city. And there was a very strict code around that. The gates would be closed in the evenings, and this fortress was closed off to all non-Jews. However, on the other side of the Volga, there was a multinational, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious, an ecumenical city, you could say, right? Where Muslims, various heretical sects of Christians as well lived. So you could find people like Manichaeans or other heretics that came out of, let's say, the Byzantine Empire, that were kind of being ran out of the Byzantine Empire. They might find themselves in this wealthy area of Khazaria known as Ital. And they could, it was a booming city. It was bustling in terms of the industries. So they could go and make money there, is the long story short. It's very metropolitan is what I'm trying to convey here. And that this other side of the city was where all of the trades and the vices would come. So that's where you would find prostitution. That's where you would find dishonest money lending. That's where you would find, could be, alcohol brewing and these kinds of, these kinds of things that would be considered more of an average sort of vice-based economy, right? Within the metropolis. So that's very interesting just to note as a side note. However, I think the more important thing to note about the Khanate itself is the structure of the Khanate under Khazarian rule. So in particular, post-Jewish Khazarian rule. So there is what's known as the sacralization of the Khazar Kaghan, right? Which is a departure from the earlier Turk traditions. And when we say Turk, there's something else we have to keep in mind here. We don't mean like Ataturk, right? We mean like the Turks as they were known as sort of disparate tribal groups that sort of loosely all came out of China when, ancient Chinese dynasties were still, active and sort of forming. They were pushing out other rival tribes, on their borderlands. So like sort of modern day Kazakhstan, right? Kind of, let's say, Eastern Kazakhstan area is thought to be sort of the genesis of what these sort of Turkic tribes that make up the main bloodlines. So maybe like where Turkmenistan is, for example, that, we have groups of others known as Turks who speak, quote, Turkic languages, right, that are still there to this day. So the idea is that that's sort of where these people come from, is that general area. As they're pushed out, they come and settle in this Caucasus region, right, of maybe what you could call, modern day Western Kazakhstan into, southern Russia and sort of northern Georgian Armenian Empire territories, right? So what's interesting about the sacralization of the Kaghan, though, is that it is a dual kingship, right? Which departs from the Turkic tradition, in which there's generally one ruler, and goes towards an Iranian monarchic tradition where there's actually two rulers, right? So this is Iranian or Persian marker number 2, right? Within their overall construction. So we keep coming back to this like heavy Persian influence, right? And a lot of the scholars who talk about this in the literature really look to this as general proofs that the people who are turning this into a kingdom are heavily influenced by like intricacies of the Persian system that could only come from living there, from really being a part of this system, not just watching it from a distance. And so there's many that look at the dual system of kingship. And there's a good quote that I have here that I'll read from one of the source texts. So there exists the Khan, the aloof king, a figurehead who is kept hidden away nearly his whole life. He has to come to the imperial he has to come from the imperial race, quote unquote. This is thought to mean the original Khazar Turknic ethnic elite, known in ancient Chinese and Persian sources as the Asena or Asena. You'll hear it pronounced both ways. A desert aristocracy renowned for their learnedness, from which both Turkic and Mongol rulers traditionally claimed descent. Only those who converted to Judaism from this tribe, however, were ever considered for this position. The king, or the Khan, is basically an impotent and sacral figurehead in nature. However, there's another ruler alongside of him called the Khan Bek. The Khan Bek was the active leader. Think queen on the chessboard, to use an analogy. This leader was the real ruler of all affairs in the Khazar kingdom. He would take them to war. He would set tax rates. He would command state affairs, etc. A real autocrat, so to speak. with comprehensive and all-encompassing power. He too was chosen from Jews, but generally non-converted Jews, i.e. the Persian bloodline of Jews who converted the rest of the Khazars in the first place. So what we're seeing emerge here, Tim, is that there's actually two classes of those within the Khazars. And we see this in the literature called the white Khazars and the black Khazars, okay? And this doesn't necessarily refer to like a racial thing. It had more to do with just where they originally came from. So in that sense, it is an ethnic divide. But I guess my point is don't think like these guys were really white skinned and those guys were really black skinned. It isn't necessarily based on that. It had more to do with their roles and what they would do. So there were the Jewish ruling elite basically is what you had in the Khan Bek and his tribe. And then the Turkic elites who had the original Khazar blood were able to sort of still maintain this, position of awe and power, but only in a figurative way, which is very interesting. It's a very interesting way to take over a people group, which is effectively the way we really need to look at this, that they figured out how to rule not alongside of this people, though that's the way they made it appear. They really, I mean, if the Khan Beks were all actually Jewish leaders from the original non-convert Jews, then they're really taking over the place, right? Yeah. So, which again, as people with money, this makes sense. In other words, this is a very easy historiography to understand if you simply understand it through the eyes of money brings power, with money brings influence, right? So the idea that, quote, these Khazars were not Jewish at all and had no Jewish blood at all is a complete misnomer that comes from Kessler, author of the 13th Tribe. He has a lot of good history in his book. However, he also has an axe to grind. And his axe to grind is that he tried to build a false historiography, a fictitious or sort of, I will just call it a fictitious historiography in order to once and for all put a death to anti-Semitism. This was his goal. He states it. In that basically, if he could prove that that the Khazars were actually just Caucasian people, they were not in any way related to any of the people who came out of Palestine during the diaspora, the original Hebrews, that basically no Europeans could hate them anymore because they're just Europeans just like everybody else, right? So this was really Arthur Kessler's great hypothesis. And that's the hypothesis that's rejected by many, not all, but many, and I'd say most Jewish scholars. However, what most Jewish scholars are not rejecting is a lot of his other history that he records, because it all comes from the source texts. So Kessler is a great example of a guy who had a good project, a good idea for a project, but he was really misguided by the axe that he was trying to grind with an a priori hypothesis about this, like the Khazars not actually being Jewish at all. So I reject that, and there's plenty of other historians that reject this notion that there was no Jewish blood within the Khazar Empire at all. It makes no sense.
If we talk about conspiracy theories, I mean, like, people tend to be pretty open about this kind of stuff. I mean, Marx wrote that he wanted a world revolution. The people who supported eugenics, they were pretty darn open about it till they got scared after World War II. And today's wonderful Great Reset Club, well, they don't hide their intentions very much, do they? So if there really is this sort of like Zionist motivation behind the war in Ukraine, why do none of like the notable Hollywood, Washington, Israeli, whatever, super passionate Zionists talk about this out in the open? Why aren't there websites about it? I'm not seeing anything here, man.
Sure. So I think the best way to answer that is to begin answering the second part of your last question, which was about like, essentially, these guys were some sort of like weird offshoot group that intermixed and interblended, and the Zionist hardliners, why on earth would they have any kind of love lost for this sort of like strange mixed race clique of Jewish warriors, right? I thought that was actually a very good part of your last question. And I did want to give some, the answer to that, and then we can roll in, I think, perfectly dovetailing with your current question. So, again, I think that question presupposes a historiography that there is this legitimate genetic group, right, known as Jews, and it can all sort of be like proven that they're like completely endogenous, meaning like interbred, and that there's this like pure bloodline that exists of like a quote Jewish gene or something, right? So the Khazarian, this particular Khazarian hypothesis that's espoused by a man named Erhan El-Hayek. He's a Jewish geneticist from Johns Hopkins. He has, in my opinion, the best scholarship, and genetic scholarship in particular, as well as historiography on this matter. I recommend everyone in the audience to look up the work of Erhan, or it's E-R-A-N, Erhan El-Hayek. So again, Johns Hopkins University, this guy's not a crackpot. He's published on Oxford University Publishing. If you guys know anything about that, that's really tough to get published on. So this guy's work is anything but a hack job. This guy is a scholar. So for him, in other words, the predominant historiography of modern Jewry says that the diaspora Jews have this direct genetic connection to ancient Judea, sort of a pure bloodline, right? That the diaspora Jews migrated into South Europe directly from ancient Judea. And this is where you get kind of the Rhineland hypothesis, as it's known, right? And that they made their way into Germany, maintaining these endogenous communities and bloodlines over the centuries, right? Again, Rhineland hypothesis. Those bloodline claims from a prominent part of the basis of the right to exist in the land now occupied and known as Israel, right? Like that actually forms the basis for the modern day claim to the land by the Zionists. So this is, if they're wrong about that, that really has some significant ramifications, right? So that historiography has been called into question by El-Hayek. So he has said that basically the modern diaspora Jews, the Ashkenazim as they're called, are in fact genetically linked, to be sure, to Jews all over the world, but that their shared ancestry is predominantly Iranian and Caucasian and not Middle Eastern per the say like Palestinian blood, but it would be Middle Eastern as far as Persia goes, right? And so like Caucasian, Central Asia, Persia. So in other words, European Jews or the Ashkenazim are not related to non-European Jews or Sephardim so much, at least in the tiny extent that they are. It's not what it was previously believed to be the relation, right? So his work is very interesting in that. So I had to cover that because that really answered that kind of like bloodline question you had from the last one about the Zionists. So to get into the next kind of greater Israel, heavenly Jerusalem, why are they not talking about Khazaria and these things openly, I guess, right? Is that kind of a fair way to sum up your question?
Kind of. I meant to say that people are very often blunt and open with their beliefs, especially when they feel like they're in a friendly audience. You see what I'm saying? So again, why do the Zionists never mention Khazaria? They don't seem to do it, man.
Right. So that's definitely a good point. And I think that that's a common misunderstanding here, a common misnomer. I think all one needs to do is simply connect the dots. In other words, I would actually argue the opposite. I think that there are people talking about it. Either we're not listening or we're not connecting the dots. And in certain cases, we couldn't understand it even if they in the cases where they are saying it, because we don't speak Hebrew. So for example, they are speaking about this openly in Hebrew media. Some of that media gets translated online and a lot of it doesn't. So typical newspapers that float around Israel, those are in Hebrew, and a lot of them are never getting, there is no online version of some of these newspapers. However, I think we could just look at a guy like Zelensky, right? I mean, he's had some pretty famous statements as of recent. However, I also would say that I think we have to be careful not to think that, that the Jews are not communicating their interest in Ukraine, because they do. They just don't make announcements to the non-Jews or non-Zionists. So let's just call it the rest of the world, on your average nightly news channels, saying, hey, we're going to take over Ukraine, guys. Like nobody's ever really that, even though WEF, right, World Economic Forum, isn't being that upfront, like, hey, we're actually, we own all of your politicians, they're in our pocket. They're like, no, we partner with them. They're our friends. They're, you know, they're adopting ESG scoring. And we think this is a wonderful thing because here's our propaganda, right? So I think that, you know, these guys aren't going to directly inform you of their plans in the Ukraine. However, they do communicate their desire for Ukraine through their actions, right? And I think that's what we can look at as kind of hardcore, you know, evidences and general motives of credibility, right, for these claims. So I think, you know, the audience has to connect the dots, really. And that would be, the real question is like, why would they tell us directly of their plans, right? So in other words, like we have to just look at like the oligarchs, for example. We can start with what it means to be a Ukrainian oligarch, right? Oligarchs in Russia are a little different than oligarchs in Ukraine. The oligarchy in the Ukraine is nearly exclusively Jewish. Like, yes, there's some Christian oligarchs down there as well, but it's, if you look at the vast majority of the top 200 wealthiest people in Ukraine, just look at the last names. It'll tell you everything you need to know about who really runs the place in terms of who has the money, who has the influence. There's a scholar by a priest, actually. He's also a scholar, Father Matthew Raphael Johnson, PhD. He has a lot of these sourced out in a work that he put out many years back, entitled, I think it's something like Putin's Populism. Very good read, by the way. He's very pro-Russia, and he basically just outlines that these are just a different class of oligarchs when we're talking about oligarchs. These people were basically all associated with Western banking houses. Many of them had family in Western banking houses. It basically created a Ukrainian Jewish elite in the post-Soviet era. These guys were informed of sales of things prior to any public announcements. They were able to get all of the credit lined up through foreign and Western banking channels to literally just take the place over when the fall happened, right? So this is a kind of a different group of folks that come out of that era, right? And it's through those people specifically that we're seeing a lot of these moves being made, right? So the Kolomoiskys of the world, right? Like these are the kinds of folks that we're talking about. They're undoubtedly connected to the other globalists, like a Bernard Henry Levy, right? French Zionist, right? Who can be seen on the streets of Ukraine, you know, being marched around by, you know, soldiers and so forth, right? These guys are all very well connected clique of folks who are running these kinds of things. And I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, there are so many Zionist interests heavily invested in and you know, with the eye on the prize of the Ukraine, right? So jumping forward to sort of the modern era, you know, why was a Jewish actor made president after the coup happens over the junta government, right? Following sort of the Western intelligence AstroTurf Maidan coup, you get a Jewish president, you get a Jewish prime minister, and you get all the Jewish oligarchs all poisoning themselves to try to take over all the industry in the East, right? In Donbass, where all these great industries are. They were all trying to piecemeal and sell this thing out like a garage sale. And what they didn't count on was two things. They didn't count on the success of Novorossiya and the how much resistance they could get out of 3 battalions of 200 men who said no, right? And then obviously that snowballs and has the snowball effect. And the second thing they didn't count on was how fast the currency would plummet, right? So when the currency plummets back then in the initial coup, you have a lot of instability that came much faster than I think these oligarchs anticipated. So they weren't able to do with the industry in the East what they had hoped to in terms of piecing it out and really just sort of building a golden parachute, you know, as they crash and collapse the place with the help of the Western hand. So I think when we really look at a lot of these moves that are being made, I just think it seems pretty obvious to me that you know, it's mostly just people sort of having this fear of maybe being called an anti-Semite or, you know, a conspiracy theorist, you know, and just want to believe sort of the narratives of the mainstream media that, oh, this is just an internal problem. You know, there's this ground up, bottom up resistance that exists in the Ukraine, and it's all legitimate. And, you know, I think a lot of that is just fan fiction, you know. And I think you'd probably agree on that last part, that like there was no like real resistance. This was all astroturfed by Western intelligence.
Hello, friends. We're having some technical difficulties, so this question is missing in terms of video, but I can ask it to Afanasi yet again. That's the power of editing. So, Afanasi, in terms of this grand conspiracy you speak of, what are your thoughts on President Zelensky himself?
I think something else we need to remember is you've got Zelensky again, this Jewish actor, quite literally, being propped up by as a junta government leader, as we're supposed to view him as some sort of legitimate leader over an Orthodox Christian Slavic nation, right? I don't understand how how anyone sees that as legitimate, right? I certainly don't. But I think that there's a couple comments by Zelensky that have been caught my ear over the last little bit. I think the number one was his comments about Ukraine becoming or poised to become a greater Israel, right? This was perhaps one of the most telling remarks by Zelensky, in my opinion. So, there was that comment, and just, I think it was in March, mid-March of this year, during the special military operation, where he called for the Jews of the world to unite with Ukraine against Russians, right? I mean, this is very telling language. Again, I think if we're just really willing to connect the dots on this, there's really only one conclusion to come to, and that's that there are some special Jewish Zionist interests in the Ukraine. So that would be kind of my contention on that, Tim.
Okay, but then, hold on. Why would the wealthy Jewish oligarchs of post-Soviet Ukraine want to finance Banderites? Bandera not only killed Russians and Poles, but also a lot of Jews. He was a very, very anti-Jewish figure. Why would they prop up people who are going to eventually kind of rise up and want to kill them? And furthermore, I know Jews personally who had to flee Ukraine for their lives to come to Russia just to survive. It's not exactly a Jewish-friendly environment all over that country right now.
Right. So this is all a very, very good road to go down. I mean, we could practically do a whole podcast on just the oligarchs and their influence and sort of their various types of controlled opposition that they set up here in this current regime. I think that to answer your question, we will probably have to go into talking a little bit about some of the main actors here. So there's Taruta or Tarutai. You'll hear. I'm not really exactly sure you pronounce his last name. There's Kolomoisky, and there's kind of their front guy for the Heavenly Jerusalem project, known as Igor Berkut, the Golden Eagle, right? Or Igor Gecko is actually his born name, I believe. This kind of clique, the cadre we're talking about here, they have very specific plans for what's going on, right? I'll say this to sort of talk about the first part of your question. I think there are a lot of different kinds of people who have fled for fear of their lives. I want to tread on this one carefully because obviously I do not know exhaustively all the different people who have left and all of the reasons for which they have left. And I have a lot of compassion for those who have had to leave their homes. As somebody who literally had to leave my home because of a Bolshevik takeover in America.
Me too, brother. Me too.
What I would analogously call, obviously, I'm speaking hyperbolically here, but I have compassion for people who have had to leave their homes and go elsewhere. So I'll tread lightly here. But I think that there were some who agree with the idea of an independent Ukraine, right? But simply didn't want to invest in, with their life, let's say, right? And some of those people left. So you have some supporters in Western Europe in particular who maybe are very pro-independent Ukraine, right? You have some who agree with the Russian side, right? Who have since come into Russia or perhaps even gone to, let's say, Georgia or Armenia for the time. I've met several of them when I've in my travels down there. Some very, very good conversations were born out of those meetings. I've been very enlightened by a lot of those people who I've gotten to talk to down there, Ukrainians who fled, that is. And I've met more who are actually pro-Russian than anti-Russian, interestingly enough. I did not expect that, but that did surprise me. So some agreed, obviously, with the Ukraine's side to begin with, but have since changed their tune as well, since they've seen the way that the war has played out, and they've seen the way that these battalions have gone about warfare. And there's actually one person that I met when we were in Armenia in particular that articulated this to me, that watching this war play out has really been the most telling thing for them. So, I think there's also legitimate fear, that these groups of people who are, and I think it's very legitimate fear here, that are kind of tweaked in the head, these NATO Nazis, right? I don't call them neo-Nazis, because there's nothing neo about the Nazis that are in the Ukraine. These are NATO handled, NATO trained descendants of World War II Nazis. We need to always remember this. The media has it all wrong, basically. And I think you'd agree with me on that, Tim, that there's this concept that there's this somehow this like resurgence of Nazism, neo-Nazism. Like, no, these people are actually the inheritors of World War II Nazism, right? You brought up the name Bandera, right? Like, for all of our listeners who are already familiar with him, this is all just a repeat for you. But for those who aren't, we're talking about an actual Nazi collaborator who was, rabidly seeking to establish this sort of independent Ukrainian Nazi state, basically, where the brand of fascism, ethno-fascism, that the German Nazis were bringing everywhere they went, would basically be set up in almost a Ukrainian fashion, right? A Ukrainian version of it would come to ancient Galicia, right? Like, this is sort of this was their narrative, right? Their historiography around it was very much, we've always been an independent people. And I'm not going to say there's no legitimate claims to say like the Galician area as an independent area. I actually think, again, to bring up a man who I'm very indebted to, Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, his book on Ukrainian nationalism is actually probably one of the best pieces ever written on this, in which he basically states a claim that there could be an organic call for a type of Ukrainian nationalism among the sort of Galician area of what's now Western Ukraine, right? But that everything we see today is all fake. It's all false nationalism. None of it's real. They're not advocating for a Galician state. They're advocating for something that is far bigger than this. And it's basically, I think that Putin and other great thinkers like Dugin have nailed it on the head with this. What the culture they're trying to build in the modern Ukraine with their false nationalism is an anti-Russia. They're building an anti-Russian state. And to do that is totally ahistoric, right? If we know anything about the Russian Empire, we know anything about the rise of Kievan Rus. Like, there is no Kievan Rus without Kiev, right? Like, this doesn't exist. The peoples that were birthed, all of the Russes that were birthed from the Russian cities, right, come from the mother city, which is Kiev. This is, the Crimean heart, right, so to speak, of the ancient Russian people. This is all. There's an integrity to it in the historiography that must be maintained. And any false historiography and false nationalism, I'm hearkening back to Prince Trubetskoy on this. For any of you who haven't read Trubetskoy, I'm big into the Slavophiles. I love to read them. If you have not read his On True and False Nationalism, it is a must read. Everyone must read that, because it more than anything shows all of the fallacies that are contained within the modern current nationalism, that brand of nationalism, we could say flavor of nationalism, that floats around in the Ukrainian circles right now. So to get back full circle, to sort of talk about these particular NATO Nazis, right? These guys are very tweaked in the head, right? And I think a lot of people are fleeing from the horrors that they've seen, not only being done prior to this in the Donbass, right? but also that they're seeing sort of being conducted even against average Ukrainian citizens who, you know, are refusing to pick up arms and fight alongside of these cowards who are hiding in schools and hiding on playgrounds, right? And they're I think leaving with good reason, many of them, right? So, you know, to talk about some of the battalions that you know, like right sector, that have Jewish presence, I mean, I think you're dealing with a lot of very cobbled together and very well curated, a very well curated group of a very specific brand of fascism that falls under what I just talked about with the false nationalism. And all this comes from the CIA, right, handling the Banderites at the end of World War II. They gave them amnesty. They let them skate. None of them hung at Nuremberg. And this was all because they came to an agreement with the you know, fledgling at the time, fledgling CIA, which was the ONI OSS, obviously. So when I say CIA, I'm speaking slightly anachronistically, or if I say Mossad here, I'm speaking slightly anachronistically. But really, all of that was handled under the auspices of MI5 at the time. So the CIA was trained by MI5. We got our intelligence network in terms of the structure of it, which comes out of the Office of Naval Intelligence and the OSS, then is rolled up underneath MI5 in a training program that then later becomes the CIA. So when I talk about the CIA handling these people, this is who I'm talking about. And when I talk about Mossad handling them, I'm talking about the proto-Israeli intelligence groups that were being formed under the MI5 at that time. You can read all about that with some basic Googling as well. These people ended up handling the Banderites at this time, and they curated them for the last 70 years. Tim, 70 years these people curated them. You can learn about this in Oliver Stone's great flick, a documentary, Ukraine on Fire, right? He talks all about this, goes into the history of it. It's a great introduction for any of your listeners who are not familiar with this particular part of the history there. So the Jewish presence and the Zionist presence among the Banderites is very fascinating, because it's basically an agreement that they came to that their group would no longer be anti-Semitic, and that they would be allowed to fight for nationalism, et cetera, but that no anti-Semitism would be tolerated any longer. And the intelligence groups that curated them, again, these groups that I just outlined, came to this agreement with them. They agreed, and since that point, anti-Semitism has been very low in that part of the Ukraine, but nonetheless, this brand of false nationalism and fascism has been flying high for 70 years, right? Oh. So this, in my opinion, explains the weird, almost seemingly contradictory presence of both Nazism as well as Jewish presence and Zionist presence there. So that's how I would actually put those two ideas together and explain them.
Okay, so let's talk about Putin, again, from a conspiratorial angle. Now, if you look at a chart of who are the oligarchs of the 90s versus who are the really, really rich elite guys today, the proportion of Jewish gentlemen has definitely declined. Some might say it's on purpose. Some might have said that that's just worked out that way. Who knows? But also, you know, in Syria, Putin has supported Assad, and Assad has been fighting against the Israeli occupation of sort of their side of the Golan Heights. So in some ways, you know, Putin and Russia have been directly working with Syria, I guess, against Israel. But if we look at things in the greater picture, overall, Russia's had generally pretty good relations with Israel over the decades. In fact, you know, Stalin kind of signed off on the existence of Israel. Let me put it this way to you, man. The Zionists in Israel have no problem with saying awful things about people they hate. Putin tends to stay out of their mouths. Why?
That's a great question. So I think that something that they share is statesmanship, and that is a rare thing to this day. You will never really hear me speaking positively of the Zionists, as I don't believe a genocidal ethno-state should be allowed to exist, and especially not be funded, right? However, I will say this about the Israelis, is that when you actually watch the way they conduct themselves, I'd say it's basically Israel and Russia that have maintained the old world, we'll call it the French high culture level of diplomacy. You watch Putin, watch how he conducts himself. The man is a statesman of statesmen. I mean, he's the only thing left, in my opinion, of the old world statesmanship. So I think that naturally what you see between these two countries on paper, let's say, and in terms of public kind of PR, right? I think that what you see in terms of the PR is statesmanship. So I think a lot of what you're commenting on, I would simply note as statesmanship. However, I'd say where the rubber meets the road, Putin in the current geopolitical milieu is the only world leader crushing the aspirations of the Zionists on a regular basis. There is no one, in my opinion, and I challenge anyone to challenge this assertion. There is no one else who is crushing at every turn the aspirations of the Zionists, other than Russia, other than Putin. So you brought up the Golan Heights. That's a great example. It's the Russian MiGs that are pushing back the Israeli fighters on the Golan Heights Syrian border. It's not. There's nobody else doing it, right? So it's him. It's him who's pushing back against the, as he said, the rootless cosmopolitans. We know who he's talking about when he says that. That's straight out of Stalin. He's talking about Jewish oligarchs. This is not a mystery, right? So again, there's this idea that like you said, that they get along, and I think that on a level of statesmanship they do get along. However, I think practically speaking, if you watch the way Putin plays this, he's smashing their teeth out in their aspirations for a greater Israel, heavenly Jerusalem project in 5 Ukrainian oblasts, and he's pushing back on them in the Golan Heights, and there's no one else doing this. So this idea is more than just an idea. I think it's evidenced in the way that he practically relates to them on the geopolitical battlefield.
Could you please elaborate by what you meant by "this is straight out of Stalin"?
Right. So Stalin has that famous quote where he talks about the rootless cosmopolitans, right? That recently when Putin used that phrase, the Western media went nuts, right? And there was these headlines about Putin's, and it was like Haaretz put one out, I think, maybe New Times Israel or one of those put out one, like, this is blatant anti-Semitism, and this is hearkening back to Stalin's purges. And there were these great sensationalistic headlines that you and I would read and just get a kick out of, right? Like I love reading that stuff because it's just like, okay, here we go again, right? Like this should be good. And then of course you read this, and then you sort of see where they're coming from, and you're like, okay, so he's calling out some Jewish oligarchs in the Ukraine, like Kolomoisky and his clique, who are putting a whole group of Russian people at risk for some pennies, right? So they can make some money, so that their Zionist political aspirations can be met. All of these guys have dual citizenship as well. I'm sure you already know this, but in case some of your listeners don't know, when we're talking about these Ukrainian oligarchs, we're talking about guys who frequent Israel, who have Israeli passports. They're basically LARPing as Ukrainians. These guys are Israelis. We just need to be plain about that. Some of them have Cypriot passports, like I think Kolomoisky has 3, and I think Tartura has 3 as well. Or Taruta, sorry, I can never say his name correctly. Sergei Taruta has the 3 as well. And there's several of them that do this, because I think there's a law around politicians not having dual citizenship. So these guys were like, hey, we'll just get triple citizenship. We don't have dual citizenship. We have triple citizenship, literally, right? So yeah, that would be kind of the way I would approach that.
So anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video and you like the opinions coming out of my big fat mouth, then join up on my Telegram channel. That's Tim Kirby Hardcore on Telegram. Link, of course, in the description.